What if I were to tell you that one of the most hated aspects of Calvinism isn't actually required by Calvinism? And what if I told you that some of the earliest Reformed theologians believed that Christ died for all, and they were still within confessional Reformed orthodoxy? And what if I were to tell you that there's more than one faithful historic way to understand the atonement within Reformed theology? I often hear people say that one of the hallmarks of Reformed theology is that Jesus didn't die for everyone. And that assumption has shaped entire debates. It has driven people away from Reformed theology, and it's turned the doctrine of limited atonement into a kind of theological boogeyman. But here's the thing, that's actually not the whole story. Now, this video isn't about refuting limited atonement, and it's not going to be a breakdown of John Owen's The Death of Death, or a cage match between him and John Davenant. And it's definitely not about adjudicating intramural disputes among confessional Reformed theologians. Rather, this video is about recovering forgotten voices that many today have never heard, and shining a light on a lesser-known but fully Reformed position on the atonement of Christ known as Hypothetical Universalism, a historic Reformed view about the extent of the atonement, the question of who Christ died for and in what sense. This video is primarily for those outside or on the edge of the Reformed tradition, those that have been told that Calvinism only has one voice on the extent of the atonement, and it just happens to be the harshest one. So if that's you, this video is for you, and I hope it helps you better understand the Reformed tradition, even if you may not agree with it, because what most people criticize when they reject Calvinism was never the only option in the first place. So here's going to be the rundown. First, we're going to define hypothetical universalism in plain terms and distinguish it from general atonement and Arminian theology. Then we'll trace its roots, not just in the Reformation, but in the medieval tradition before it. After that, we'll walk through Reformed theologians that explicitly taught it. And finally, we'll talk about why this matters, not just theologically, but pastorally and apologetically. But before we dive into it, welcome to Canon Creed. My name is Miles, and this is the channel where we are bullish on recovering classical Protestant faith practice and piety, all in a digestible manner. So if that sort of thing interests you, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which Christian tradition you are listening from. When people hear the phrase hypothetical universalism, they almost instinctively recoil. It sounds like some kind of theological halfway house, maybe a slippery slope to Arminianism or even universal salvation. But it's not. In fact, hypothetical universalism is a historically Reformed view of the extent of the atonement, and contrary to many of the hard limitarian gatekeepers, it's been part of our tradition from the very beginning. To put it simply, hypothetical universalism teaches that Christ's death is sufficient for and offered to all, but it's efficient only for the elect. Or to put it another way, the atonement is unlimited in provision, but limited in application. The term hypothetical doesn't mean the atonement is theoretical. It means that salvation is genuinely offered to all on the condition of faith. If anyone believes, they will be saved, because Christ's death is actually sufficient to save them. In this stream of the Reformed tradition, the sincerity of the gospel offer rests precisely on this real universal sufficiency of Christ's death. John Davenant, a Reformed Anglican bishop and delegate to the Synod of Dort, put it like this: "He is said indeed to have died for all men as to the sufficiency of his death, but for his sheep or his elect as to its efficacy." So Davenant, like many others in the Reformed tradition, taught that Christ died with a twofold intent: a general intent to make salvation possible and genuinely available to all, and a special intent to effectually save the elect through sovereign grace. In other words, Christ had to have died for a person in some sense in order for their salvation to be possible. And hypothetically speaking, every single human being is savable, even if every single one won't be saved in the end. But you're probably asking, if that's what hypothetical universalism teaches, then what makes that different from general universal atonement or Arminianism? And the key distinction is intent. In Arminian theology, Christ's death is meant for everyone equally, but it only becomes effective if one chooses to accept it. In Reformed Hypothetical Universalism, Christ's death is genuinely for all in terms of offer and sufficiency, but is designed to actually save the elect through the effectual call of the Holy Spirit. So, Hypothetical Universalism isn't a compromise, it's not Calvinism light. It's a distinct and historically reformed way of affirming both the richness of the atonement and the sovereignty of God's grace, all while taking seriously the biblical language about Christ dying for the whole world. So, to be clear, Hypothetical Universalism is not Arminian theology. It's not what's often called four-point Calvinism either. That label is anachronistic and honestly misleading, as I'm going to show later. But that's Hypothetical Universalism in plain terms. One atonement offered to all, applied to the elect. But this distinction between sufficiency and efficacy didn't begin with Davenant. The Reformers did not invent it. They actually received it. And to see that, we need to go back, not just to the 16th century, but to the 12th. Long before Davenant, medieval theologian Peter Lombard articulated this same exact structure in the sentences. He writes, Christ offered himself on the cross for all men, as to the sufficiency of the price, but for the elect only as to its efficacy, because he brings salvation to the predestinate alone. So this formulation is what would later be known as the Lombardian Formula, and it became a theological cornerstone of medieval theology, and it shaped the atonement doctrine of both strict particularists and hypothetical universalists in the Reformed tradition. But it's important to understand that they apply it differently. Particularists affirm sufficiency for all as a formal category, something true of Christ's death by virtue of its infinite worth, but maintain that it was only ever intended for the elect. Hypothetical Universalists, on the other hand, affirm that same sufficiency, but see it as part of Christ's actual redemptive intent, that he died to make salvation genuinely possible for all, thereby grounding the sincere and well-founded offer of the gospel to every person. The application remains particular, but the offer is universal and real. So while both sides appeal to Lombard, the hypothetical universalists put more theological weight on the sufficiency side of the formula, not just as a theoretical category, but as a meaningful part of the atonement's design. And that theological trajectory did not stop with Lombard. His distinction became foundational for later medieval thinkers like Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and Thomas Aquinas, each of whom would take the sufficiency-efficiency distinction further in shaping the Church's understanding of the atonement. Aquinas, for example, writes that the merit of Christ as to its sufficiency equally regards all people, but not as to its efficiency. This arises partly from the free will, partly from the election of God, through which the effect of Christ's merits is mercifully conferred upon some, but by his just judgment is withdrawn from others. So for Aquinas, Christ's merits are sufficient for all, but not applied to all, because God sovereignly applies them to some and not others. Sound familiar? That's because it is. It's the very distinction later sharpened by early Reformed theologians like Ursinus, Musculus, and Davenant, who would later build on and sharpen this distinction within a more fully articulated doctrine of election and effectual calling. So when we say hypothetical universalism is Reformed, we're also saying it's Catholic, or universal in the best sense. It's grounded in the theological inheritance of the Church, not invented in opposition to it. But now let's take a look at some of these earliest Reformed theologians, those that helped shape the tradition from the ground up, and see what they had to say about this. First, I want to look at Heinrich Bullinger, Ulrich Zwingli's successor in Zurich and the architect of the Second Helvetic Confession. In Sermon 7 of his Decades, he very plainly says, quote, Christians know that the sacrifice of Christ, once offered, is always effectual to make satisfaction for all the sins of all men in the whole world and of all men of all ages. Close quote. That doesn't sound like strict high Calvinist particularism, because it's not. And Bullinger wasn't a marginal figure. His Second Helvetic Confession became one of the most widely adopted Reformed confessions of the 16th century, embraced in Switzerland, Hungary, parts of Germany, and even by the Church of Scotland. Next is Zacharias Ursinus, the primary author of the Heidelberg Catechism, one of the parts of the Three Forms of Unity alongside the Canons of Dort and the Belgic Confession. In his commentary on the Catechism, specifically on question and answer 37, he writes, Christ satisfied for all as it respects the sufficiency of the satisfaction which he made, but not as it respects the application thereof. But the satisfaction is made ours by an application, which is also twofold, the former of which is made by God when he justifies us on account of the merit of his Son. The latter is accomplished by us through faith. Without this application, the satisfaction of Christ is of no benefit to us. So Ursinus not only distinguishes sufficiency and efficacy, but he ties both to God's sovereign will and the necessity of faith, avoiding both universal salvation and presumption. Next, though, let's take a look at Wolfgang Musculus, a lesser-known reformer and early contributor to Reformed theology. In his Commonplaces, he writes, "We know that all do not become partakers of this redemption, but the perdition of those who are not saved by no means hinders this redemption from being called universal, since it is not destined for one group of people, but for the whole world." Again, this is the language of universal sufficiency, not as a concession, but as a Reformed conviction. These weren't fringe thinkers, and this wasn't a fringe view. It helped build the theological scaffolding of the early Reformed tradition, honoring the free offer of the gospel while still upholding God's sovereign grace and freedom to save for his own eternal glory. But to this list, we also have to add James Ussher, the Irish Archbishop of Armagh and one of the most respected Reformed theologians of the 17th century. Ussher's formulation of hypothetical universalism echoed the Lombardian distinction, but applied it differently than strict particularists like Theodore Beza and William Perkins. He affirmed that Christ's death was sufficient for all and intended to make all humanity a fit subject for mercy, while maintaining particular efficacy for the elect. As Richard Snoddy notes, Ussher's hypothetical universalism was his belief that Christ died for all humanity, making salvation possible upon the condition of faith. Unlike the Arminians, hypothetical universalists of Ussher's ilk affirmed special election and maintained the necessity of God's special grace in the application of the redemption obtained at the cross. And Snoddy even goes on to clarify that Ussher went from holding the high Calvinist particularist view to affirming hypothetical universalism as early as 1602, based on his earliest catechisms. By the time of the Synod of Dort in the 17th century, hypothetical universalism wasn't just whispered about, it was actively discussed. And while Dort rejected the Arminian view of universal atonement, it did not exclude hypothetical universalism. As Reformed historian Richard Muller notes, the canons of Dort, in affirming the standard distinction of a sufficiency of Christ's death for all and its efficiency for the elect, actually refrain from canonizing either the early form of hypothetical universalism or the assumption that Christ's sufficiency serves only to leave the non-elect without excuse. Various of the signatories of the canons were hypothetical universalists, not only the English delegation, but also some of the delegates from Bremen and Nassau. Even the Emeraldians were able to argue that their teaching did not run contrary to the canons. In other words, the non-speculative, non-Emeraldian form of hypothetical universalism was new in neither the decades after Dort nor a softening of the tradition. The views of Davenant, Ussher, and Preston followed out a resident trajectory long recognized as orthodox among the Reformed. So multiple delegates at Dort explicitly affirmed hypothetical universalism, and the Synod's final wording left deliberate room for it. But it's critical to note here, affirming hypothetical universalism does not make someone an Emeraldian. The two are often confused, but they're not the same. And this really matters. Emeraldianism, often called four-point Calvinism, involves more than affirming that Christ died for all. It actually reorders the decrees of God. Without going too deep into the weeds here, Emeraldianism teaches that God first wills to save all people, and only afterward elects individuals based on foreseen faith. And that conditional view reshapes the entire logic of Reformed soteriology, which is why many are skeptical of hypothetical universalism. They think it's Emeraldianism in disguise. But that's not what Davenant and Martinius and Bullinger were teaching. The hypothetical universalism permitted at Dort retained unconditional election, particular efficacy, and the Reformed insistence that Christ's death, though sufficient for all, is efficient only for the elect. So in short, hypothetical universalism in the Reformed tradition kept the backbone of Reformed soteriology intact, whereas Emeraldianism reshuffled its architecture. which is why calling hypothetical universalism four-point Calvinism is not just an anachronistic oversimplification, it's historically and theologically inaccurate. This historically grounded stream didn't vanish after Dort, by the way. The same theological breathing room carried forward, and it can be seen just a few decades later in the Westminster Confession. Such as in chapter 8, where we read in part, "To all those for whom Christ hath purchased redemption, he doth certainly and effectually apply and communicate the same, but the Lord Jesus makes intercession for all those who believe on him." In other words, the confession intentionally avoids shutting the door on a view like John Davenant's. The confession carefully maintains the distinction. Redemption is applied effectually to the elect, while Christ's intercession is tied to those who believe, a category broader in wording and deliberately so. And modern respected Reformed theologians have also noted this. Such as J.V. Fesco, for example, who writes, "While hypothetical universalists may be scarce in 21st century Reformed theology, they were common in the early modern period. This chapter will show that the Westminster Standards are committed to the historic doctrine of Christ enunciated by the ecumenical councils, that Christ holds a threefold office of prophet, priest, and king, and that the confession was written in such a way as to accommodate and allow hypothetical universalism, while at the same time denying remonstrant views on the extent of Christ's satisfaction." So why does this matter? Because it clears away some major misconceptions, even among Reformed Christians. There are many within our own tradition who try to gatekeep it, insisting that only strict limitarianism is confessionally valid, but this is simply not true. When critics say Calvinism teaches that God only wanted to save a small remnant and no one else, they're responding to just one strand within the tradition, and they're mistaking it for the whole. Hypothetical universalism shows that the Reformed tradition has always included voices who held together two biblical truths: the sincere, well-grounded offer of the gospel to all people, and the particular redemption of the elect. That's not a contradiction, it's a synthesis, one that's faithful to Scripture and rooted in the broader Catholic tradition of the Church. And this wasn't a fringe view. Later Reformed figures like William Twiss, Richard Baxter, and John Preston all carried this line of thought forward within confessional orthodoxy. And for those who have struggled with Calvinism's hardest edges, maybe even walked away because it felt too cold, too abstract, or too narrow, this forgotten stream offers a way to re-engage without compromise. The Reformed tradition is not a monolith in this area, and it never has been, which is why recovering that reality does three important things. One, it helps us speak more accurately about our own tradition. Many of my fellow Reformed believers need to come to terms with the fact that we're here and we belong. We're not Amyraldians. We're not compromising the tradition. We are confessionally Reformed Christians who believe in both the Bible and our confessions, which teach that Jesus died for all, and that the gospel can be sincerely and truthfully offered to all people without hedging. And with recent retrieval work making this more widely known, it's time for those that are guarding the gates from their ivory towers, such as at Westminster SoCal or the New Calvinist movement, to acknowledge this, especially given that New Calvinism, a largely Baptist-led movement emerging in the late 20th century, reimagined elements of the Reformed tradition and now often assumes the role of trying to define what does and doesn't count as Reformed. The irony. But secondly, it helps outsiders hear us without caricatures. People need to understand that Reformed theology has never been as narrow as it's often portrayed in this area. For far too long, only one stream has held the microphone, and it's time that the rest of the tradition be heard and let those on the outside see the fuller picture. And thirdly, lastly, it helps all of us, Reformed or not, see the gospel of grace in sharper focus. Maybe you're someone that's been told Calvinism teaches that you can't know if Christ died for you. Maybe that's even driven you away from the tradition entirely. Well, if that's you, I hope this video has helped you see it's not that simple, and it never was. Because what's often rejected as Calvinism isn't all that Calvinism has ever been.